The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Not in the mail. Not by courier. It was slipped under the door of a motel room that smelled like mildew and carpet cleaner, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear the highway on the other side. Margaret Calloway sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it for a long time before she picked it up. Her hands were steady. They had been steady through everything. Through the papers. Through the conversation that lasted 11 minutes, 47 years reduced to 11 minutes and a signature line. Through packing 2 suitcases while her husband's sister stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, watching like a security guard, making sure nothing valuable walked out the door. Steady hands. That was all Margaret had left. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of legal paper, a property transfer document bearing a name she had never heard spoken aloud in all her years of marriage. Arden Hollow. A parcel of land and structures, located in the rural hills of eastern Kentucky, deeded originally to one Franklin Calloway, her husband's father, and sealed by county order in 1958. The document had been meant for Gerald. Her husband. Or rather, her former husband, as of 9 days ago. His attorney, a man named Whitmore who wore suits that cost more than Margaret's car, had been sorting through the final asset disclosures when this particular file slipped into the wrong stack. Margaret's stack. The one that contained the things Gerald didn't want. The things no one wanted. By the time anyone noticed the error, Margaret had already read it. And by the time Whitmore called the motel asking for it back, she had already looked up the county records. The property was real. It was legally transferred. And no one in the Calloway family had set foot on it in over 60 years. She didn't answer the phone when it rang again. Margaret was 53 years old. She had married Gerald Calloway when she was 6 days past her 19th birthday, in a church with yellow walls and a piano that stuck on the high notes. She had loved him. Not the way love looks in movies, loud and obvious, but the way it looks when 2 people build 47 years of meals cooked, bills paid, holidays survived, silences endured, and small kindnesses exchanged without anyone keeping score. She had believed it would last. Not because she was naive, but because she had invested everything she had into making it so. The house they lived in, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio, had been purchased with money from both of them. Margaret had worked as a bookkeeper for 22 years at a regional hardware chain. She had never missed a payment on anything in her life. But the house was in Gerald's name. So was the car. So were the savings accounts, the retirement funds, the life insurance policies. When Gerald's sister Patricia and his brother Dale began pressuring him during his illness 2 years ago, when the tremors started and the doctor used words like progressive and irreversible, it wasn't Margaret they consulted. It was a lawyer. Patricia had never liked Margaret. That was no secret. She had made it clear from the beginning that she considered her brother's wife beneath the family, a bookkeeper from a nothing town who had no business marrying into the Calloway name. Dale was quieter about it, but no less deliberate. He had handled Gerald's finances for the last decade, and when the time came, he made sure the numbers told the story he wanted them to tell. The divorce was Gerald's idea. Or at least, that's what the papers said. Margaret believed it was Patricia's voice behind the words, Dale's hand behind the pen. Gerald, by then, could barely hold a conversation without drifting. He signed because they told him to sign. And just like that, 47 years became a line on a legal document. Margaret walked out of the house she had helped build with 2 suitcases, a wool coat, a framed photograph of her mother, and $1,100 in a checking account that would be empty inside a month. No children. She and Gerald had tried for years before the doctors told them it wasn't going to happen. That absence, which had once been a private grief shared between them, now became something else entirely. It meant there was no one to call. No one to stay with. No one who would stand up in a room and say this is wrong. She checked into the Bluebird Motel off Route 35. $41 a night. The room had a television bolted to the dresser and a window that faced the parking lot. She sat on the bed that first night and did not cry. Not because she wasn't broken, but because she had already decided that broken was not the same as finished. The call came 3 days after the envelope. Not from Whitmore. From Dale. His voice was the same as it always was, measured, careful, coated in a politeness that never quite reached sincerity. "Margaret," he said, as if he were greeting a neighbor he barely knew, "we need to talk about a document that was included in your packet by mistake." She held the phone to her ear and said nothing. "It's a property transfer," Dale continued. "An old family holding. It was never meant to go to you. It was filed with the wrong set of disclosures. Whitmore's office is sending a courier tomorrow to collect it." She looked at the document on the nightstand. The ink. The seal. The legal transfer. Her name on the line. "It has my name on it," she said quietly. "That was a clerical error," Dale said, and his voice tightened, just slightly, around the edges. "It belongs to the family." Margaret closed her eyes. "I am the family," she said. "Or I was. For 47 years. Dale didn't respond right away. When he did, the politeness was thinner. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Margaret." She hung up. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the ice machine down the hall clunk and rattle, and she thought about Arden Hollow. About why no one had touched it in 60 years. About why Gerald had never mentioned it. About why the Calloway family, who fought over everything from holiday seating arrangements to who inherited their mother's china, had left an entire property off the books for more than half a century. She pulled the document out again and read it by the dim light of the bedside lamp. County of Harlan. Commonwealth of Kentucky. Property sealed by order of Franklin Calloway, 1958. Structures on premises not to be entered or altered. That was unusual. Not just abandoned. Sealed. Deliberately, legally, formally sealed. And the Calloways had simply walked away from it. By morning she had made up her mind. She packed both suitcases into the trunk of the car she had borrowed from a former coworker, a rusted Civic with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked on the left side, and she drove south. The drive from Dayton to Harlan County took just under 5 hours. She stopped once for gas and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since dawn. The deeper she went into Kentucky, the narrower the roads became. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches bare and skeletal against the gray winter sky. The GPS lost signal twice. She followed the county road numbers from the document instead, written in a clerk's careful hand decades ago. When she finally turned onto the gravel path marked with a leaning post that read Hollow Road in faded paint, the car bounced and scraped over ruts so deep she had to slow to a crawl. The path climbed uphill for nearly a mile before the trees opened and the property appeared. Margaret stopped the car. She sat there for a full minute, engine idling, wipers pushing a light drizzle off the glass. The house, if you could call it that, sat at the far end of a clearing overgrown with dead brush and twisted fence posts. It was a 2-story structure, wood-framed, with a wraparound porch that sagged on one side like a jaw gone slack. The roof had caved in over the left wing. Windows on the ground floor were boarded from the inside. Behind the house, further up the slope, she could make out the shape of a second structure, a barn or a workshop, larger than the house itself, its double doors chained shut with a padlock the size of a fist. The whole place looked like it had been holding its breath since 1958 and had finally forgotten how to exhale. She turned off the engine. The silence that followed was complete. Not peaceful. Not restful. Just complete. Margaret opened the car door and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled like wet earth and old wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or iron or time itself. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the house. Her shoes sank slightly into the soft ground with each step. The porch groaned under her weight but held. The front door was swollen shut, warped by decades of moisture and neglect. She had to put her shoulder into it twice before it gave way with a long, low creak that echoed through the empty rooms beyond. Inside, the air was colder than outside. darker. Dust hung in the faint light that pushed through the gaps in the boarded windows. The floor was covered in a fine layer of grit and fallen plaster. Leaves had blown in through cracks in the walls and settled into small drifts in the corners. Furniture sat where it had been left. A kitchen table with 2 chairs. A cast-iron stove with its pipe still rising through the ceiling. A rocking chair by the window, turned to face a view that no one had looked at in 60 years. Margaret moved through the room slowly. Not searching. Not yet. Just seeing. In the back hallway she found a closet with a shelf of mason jars, still sealed, their contents dark and unrecognizable. On the wall beside them, a calendar from 1957, the page turned to October. Whoever lived here last had stopped counting the days sometime before the new year. She didn't go upstairs. The staircase looked uncertain, the 3rd step cracked clean through. Instead she went back outside and stood in the clearing, looking up at the larger structure on the hill. The chained doors. The padlock. Sealed. That was the word from the document. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Sealed. There was a difference. The first night was hard. Not dangerous. Just hard. Margaret slept in the car with the engine running for heat, waking every hour to the sound of wind pushing through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch giving way under the weight of ice. By morning the drizzle had turned to a thin frost that coated everything in a pale white shell. She found a general store 11 miles down the road, a low cinderblock building with a hand-painted sign that read Keller's. The woman behind the counter, mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses perched on her nose, looked Margaret over once and then again. "You the one moved up to the Calloway place," she said. It wasn't a question. Margaret set a jug of water and a box of matches on the counter. "I'm staying there for a while," she said. The woman, whose name tag read Bess, didn't blink. "Nobody's been up there in years," she said. "Longer than years." Margaret nodded. "I know." Bess rang up the items slowly, deliberately, like she was deciding how much to say. "My daddy used to work with Franklin Calloway," she said. "Back when the Hollow was still active. Before they shut everything down." Margaret looked up. "What was up there?" she asked. Bess paused. Her fingers rested on the register keys. "Depends on who you ask," she said carefully. "Some folks say it was mining. Some say it was something else. All I know is Franklin sealed that place up tight one winter and told everybody to stay clear. Never explained why. Never came back either." Margaret took her bag. "Did anyone ever try to find out?" she asked. Bess met her eyes. "Couple of people over the years. County inspector came once in the 80s. Didn't stay long. Said the structures were unsafe and left it at that." She paused again. Whatever Franklin locked up there, he meant for it to stay locked. Margaret thanked her and left. She sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine. Her eyes drifted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone watching. The road behind her was empty. Back at the property she began to work. Not on the sealed building. Not yet. On the house. She cleared the main room first, dragging debris outside and piling it near the tree line. The cast-iron stove, she discovered, was still functional. The chimney pipe was clogged with nests and soot, but after an hour of careful cleaning she managed to coax a small fire to life. The warmth it threw was modest, barely enough to take the edge off the cold, but it changed the room. Made it feel less like a ruin and more like a place someone could exist in. She fixed the front door next, planing the swollen edge with a hand tool she found in the kitchen drawer, a small block plane with a wooden handle worn smooth by use. Franklin's, she assumed. Or whoever had lived here last. She worked slowly, carefully, the way she had always worked. The way she had kept books for 22 years, column by column, number by number, making sure everything balanced before moving on. By the end of the 3rd day she had a livable room, a working stove, and a porch that no longer threatened to collapse underfoot. She had also found something she hadn't expected. In the back of the kitchen closet, behind the mason jars, tucked into a gap between the wall studs, was a small tin box. She pried it open with a butter knife. Inside was a key. Heavy, iron, old. And beneath it, a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, written in a hand she didn't recognize. The note was short. 3 lines. Do not let them have it. The land remembers what they did. And so does what's underneath. Margaret held the key in her palm. It was cold. Solid. The kind of weight that meant something. She looked out the window toward the chained building on the hill. The padlock. The sealed doors. The 60 years of silence. She closed her hand around the key and placed it in her coat pocket. Not yet, she told herself. But soon. That night, as she sat by the stove with her coat draped over her shoulders and the fire crackling low, her phone buzzed. A text from Dale. Last chance, Margaret. Return the document or we involve attorneys. She read it once. Then set the phone face down on the table. Outside, the wind moved through the hollow like a voice trying to remember the words to something old. Margaret pulled the rocking chair closer to the stove, sat down, and let the warmth settle into her bones. She didn't answer Dale. She didn't need to. Whatever was sealed in that building on the hill had waited 60 years. It could wait a little longer. But not much. The days that followed moved slowly, the way days do when you are alone and the world has stopped expecting anything from you. Margaret settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. She woke before dawn, fed the stove, boiled water for coffee in a dented tin pot she found under the sink, and stepped outside to watch the frost burn off the clearing as the sun climbed over the ridge. It was quiet work, living. But it was hers. She patched the kitchen window with a sheet of heavy plastic and duct tape she had bought from Bess's store. She swept the upstairs hallway, testing each board with her weight before trusting it. The third step on the staircase she replaced entirely, pulling a plank from the back porch that was still solid enough to hold. She wasn't a carpenter. She had never built or repaired anything larger than a bookshelf. But she understood how things fit together. Numbers had taught her that. 22 years of columns and ledgers had trained her eyes to see when something was off, when a line didn't match, when a total didn't balance. A house wasn't so different. You looked at what was broken, figured out what it needed, and you fixed it one piece at a time. On the 5th morning she stood at the edge of the clearing and looked up at the building on the hill. It sat there the way it had sat for decades, quiet and heavy and sealed. The chain across the double doors had rusted into a single dark mass, and the padlock that held it was thick with corrosion. But the key in her pocket was iron, and iron didn't forget what it was made for. She didn't go up that morning. She told herself she wasn't ready. That the house needed more work first. That the weather was too cold, the ground too slick. All of it was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was simpler and harder to admit. She was afraid of what she might find. Not danger. Not something lurking in the dark. She was afraid of finding out that 60 years of silence had been protecting nothing at all. That whatever Franklin Calloway had sealed away was gone or worthless or meaningless, and that she had driven 5 hours and gambled the last shred of her dignity on a dead man's empty room. That fear kept her on the ground floor for 3 more days. On the 8th day, Dale called again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a voicemail, and his voice had changed. The measured politeness was gone. In its place was something tighter, more urgent. Margaret, this has gone far enough. I spoke with Whitmore and we are preparing a formal petition to have the property transfer reversed. You have no legal standing to that land. It was never part of the marital settlement. You need to come to your senses before this gets ugly. She listened to it once, standing on the porch with the phone pressed to her ear and the wind pulling at her hair. Then she deleted it. An hour later, another voicemail. This time from Patricia. Her voice was sharper, higher, carrying the particular edge of someone who had spent a lifetime believing she was owed deference and was furious to discover she wasn't getting it. "I don't know what you think you're doing down there, Margaret, but let me be very clear. That property belongs to the Calloway family. Not to you. You were Gerald's wife. That's all. And now you're not even that. Whatever game you're playing, it ends now." Margaret set the phone on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the block plane, walked back to the porch, and continued working on the railing she had started that morning. Patricia's words sat in the air for a while, like smoke. You were Gerald's wife. That's all. 47 years. 47 years of breakfasts and grocery runs and doctor's appointments and quiet evenings and holidays spent making sure everyone else was comfortable. That's all. She pressed the plane along the wood. A thin curl of shaving peeled away, pale and clean. She pressed again. Another curl. Another. The rhythm steadied her. It always had. Bess came up to the property unannounced on the 9th day. She arrived in a battered green pickup, the bed loaded with firewood. Didn't ask, didn't explain, just backed the truck up to the porch and started unloading. Margaret came outside and stood there watching. You didn't have to do that, she said. Bess set a split log on the pile and wiped her gloves on her coat. I know I didn't, she said. But that stove eats wood like it's got something to prove, and you don't have enough cut to last the week. They stacked the wood together in silence for a while. Then Bess straightened up and looked toward the building on the hill. You been up there yet? She asked. Margaret shook her head. Not yet. Bess nodded slowly. My daddy told me something once, she said, about Franklin Calloway. Said he was the kind of man who didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. And the last thing he ever said about that place up there was that it wasn't his to open. That it belonged to whoever came after and was willing to stay. Margaret looked at her. What does that mean? She asked. Bess shrugged. Couldn't tell you, she said. But I'll say this. You're the first person in 60 years who stayed longer than an afternoon. That might mean something. She climbed back into her truck, gave a short wave, and drove back down the gravel road. Margaret watched the taillights disappear into the trees. Then she looked up at the hill again. The building sat there. Patient. Unmoved. Like it had heard every word and was simply waiting. On the 11th day, she went up. The ground was frozen hard enough to hold her weight without slipping. She carried the iron key in her right hand, the block plane in her left, not because she needed it, but because the weight of something familiar in her grip made the walk easier. The building was larger up close than it looked from below. A tall, wide structure with stone foundations and timber walls that had gone silver with age. The roof was intact, which surprised her. Whatever Franklin had built here, he had built it to last. The chain across the doors was exactly as corroded as she had expected. But the padlock, when she looked at it closely, was different. It wasn't rusted shut. It was sealed with wax. A thick layer of dark wax had been poured over the keyhole and the shackle, preserving the mechanism beneath. Someone hadn't just locked this building. They had made sure it could be unlocked again. By the right person. With the right key. Margaret used the edge of the block plane to chip away the wax. It came off in brittle flakes, revealing brass beneath, tarnished but intact. She slid the iron key into the lock. It resisted for a moment, stiff from decades of disuse. Then it turned. The sound it made was small. A click. Just a click. But it carried the weight of 60 years behind it. The chain fell away and hit the frozen ground with a dull, heavy clatter. Margaret pulled the doors open. They swung wide on hinges that groaned once, then held. Inside was dark. Not the kind of dark that comes from a room with no windows. The kind that comes from a room that has been sealed so completely that even air forgot how to move through it. The smell hit her first. Cold metal. Dry paper. Something faintly chemical, like old varnish or machine oil. She stepped inside and waited for her eyes to adjust. The building was a single large room, the size of a small barn, with a packed dirt floor and a ceiling high enough to stand in comfortably. Along the far wall, wooden shelving units ran floor to ceiling, stacked with boxes, filing cabinets, and rolled documents held together with twine. A heavy wooden desk sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in a layer of fine dust that had settled undisturbed for decades. On the desk was a typewriter, an ink pot dried to black glass, and a stack of papers held down by a chunk of raw stone the size of a fist. To the left, against the stone wall, stood a drafting table tilted at an angle, with a large rolled map pinned open across its surface. The map was yellowed but legible, hand-drawn with precise, deliberate lines. It showed the property, the hollow, the surrounding ridges, and beneath it all, a network of lines running deep underground, marked with notations in a tight, careful hand. Margaret stepped closer. The notations were technical, words she recognized from years of bookkeeping for a hardware chain that served contractors and mining outfits across the region. Core samples. Mineral deposits. Subsurface rights. And one phrase, circled twice in red ink, underlined with a force that nearly tore the paper. Apex Mineral Trust. Fraudulent survey. 1957, her breath caught. She stood there for a long time, reading the map, tracing the lines with her finger, following the notations from one end of the property to the other. Then she turned to the shelves. The boxes were labeled in the same careful hand. Each one dated, each one sealed with the same dark wax that had covered the padlock. Margaret opened the first one, peeling the wax away gently. Inside were documents. Dozens of them. Land surveys, mineral rights assessments, geological reports, and correspondence, letters between Franklin Calloway and a series of attorneys, geologists, and county officials spanning from 1949 to 1957. She sat on the floor with the box between her knees and began to read. The story that emerged was not what she expected. It was worse. Franklin Calloway had been a landowner, a modest one by the standards of eastern Kentucky in the 1940s. He held mineral rights to the property and to several adjacent parcels, rights that had been in the family for 3 generations. In 1949, a company called Apex Mineral Trust approached him with an offer to lease the subsurface rights for a series of exploratory core samples. Franklin agreed. What he didn't know, what the documents made devastatingly clear, was that Apex had already conducted unauthorized surveys of the property and knew exactly what lay beneath it. The geological reports in the box, marked confidential and never meant for Franklin's eyes, described a deposit of natural gas and rare earth minerals so extensive that it stretched beneath not just the Calloway property but across an entire section of the county. Worth, by the estimates of the company's own geologists, tens of millions of dollars even by 1950s valuations. Apex had planned to acquire the rights quietly, extract what they needed, and move on before anyone understood what had been taken. But Franklin found out. A geologist who had worked on the unauthorized survey, a man named Harlan Webb, had grown uneasy with what the company was doing. He contacted Franklin directly and sent him copies of the confidential reports, the real surveys, the ones that showed the true extent and value of what lay beneath the land. Franklin didn't go to court. He didn't go to the press. He sealed the property. Every document, every survey, every piece of correspondence, every scrap of evidence that proved what Apex had done and what the land was truly worth, he locked inside this building and walked away. And then he told his family to forget the place existed. Margaret read for hours. The cold seeped into her legs and her back, but she didn't move. The fire in the house below had long since gone to embers. The light outside shifted from gray to gold to gray again. She read letters from Franklin to his wife, explaining what he had found and why he couldn't fight it alone. She read legal opinions from a county attorney who warned him that Apex had connections in the state legislature and that any public challenge would be buried before it reached a courtroom. She read the final letter, dated December 1957, addressed to no one in particular, written in a hand that was slower than the others, less steady. I am sealing this place because I cannot win and I will not lose. What is beneath this land belongs to whoever holds the deed. The surveys prove it. The mineral rights prove it. The law proves it. But the law means nothing when the men who write it are the same men who profit from breaking it. So I am locking the door. And I am trusting that one day, someone with the deed in their hand and the patience to read what I have left behind will finish what I could not. Margaret set the letter down. Her hands were shaking. Not from the cold. From the weight of understanding. She looked around the room, at the boxes, the shelves, the map, the desk where a man had sat 60 years ago and decided that the only way to protect the truth was to seal it in the dark and wait. Franklin Calloway had not abandoned this place. He had armed it. And the weapon he had left behind was paper. Documentation. Proof. The kind of proof that no amount of money or influence could erase, because it existed in the words of the very people who had tried to steal what was beneath the ground. She stood up slowly. Her knees ached. Her back was stiff. But something else had shifted, something inside that she couldn't name yet but could feel settling into place like a beam finding its footing after years of leaning wrong. She walked to the door of the building and looked out over the clearing. The sun was almost gone. The trees stood black against a sky that was bruising into purple. Below, the house waited, dark, the stove cold. She looked down at the key in her hand. Then back at the room behind her. Franklin's words echoed in her mind. Someone with the deed in their hand. And the patience to read. She had the deed. She had the patience. And now she had the proof. Margaret pulled the doors shut behind her. She didn't lock them. There was no need. Whatever had been sealed in this room for 60 years was hers now. Not because of a clerical error. Not because of a lawyer's mistake. Because she had stayed. Because she had read what was written. Because she had done what no one in the Calloway family had ever bothered to do. She had opened the door and paid attention to what was inside. The walk back to the house felt different. Shorter. Lighter. The cold was still there, still sharp, still pressing against her skin. But it didn't reach as deep as it had before. Inside, she rebuilt the fire. Fed it slowly, carefully, the way she always did. And when the warmth began to push back against the dark, she sat down at the kitchen table with the first box of documents and began to organize them. Column by column. Page by page. Number by number. The way she had always worked. The way she had always been good at working. The way no one had ever given her credit for. Outside, the wind moved through the hollow again. But this time it didn't sound like forgetting. It sounded like something waking up. The next morning she drove to the county courthouse in Harlan. The building was old, brick-fronted, with marble floors that echoed under her shoes. She carried a folder with her, thin, containing only the property deed and the most critical of Franklin's documents, the confidential apex survey that showed the full extent of the mineral deposit. She approached the clerk's office and asked to see the current mineral rights records for the Calloway property in Arden Hollow. The clerk, a young man with a careful manner and wire-rimmed glasses, disappeared into the back for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, his expression had changed. He set a file on the counter and opened it slowly. According to our records, he said, the mineral rights to that parcel were never transferred. They remain with the deed holder. He looked up at her. That would be you. Margaret nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She asked him to make certified copies of the records. He did, stamping each one with the county seal, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he understood that what he was handling mattered more than the paper it was printed on. On her way out, she passed a woman in the hallway who stopped and stared at her. The woman was older, heavy-set, with a face that looked like it had been carved by decades of hard weather and harder conversations. She looked at the folder in Margaret's hand, then at Margaret's face. "You're up at the Calloway place," the woman said. "Word travels in small counties." Margaret met her gaze. "I am." The woman studied her for a moment. Then, quietly, almost to herself, she said, "Good. About time somebody went back up there." She walked away without another word. Margaret stood in the hallway, holding the folder against her chest. The marble floor shone under the fluorescent lights. Through the tall windows, she could see the hills rising beyond the town, green and gray and ancient, holding everything that had been buried and waiting beneath them. She walked out into the cold air and drove back to the hollow. The road felt shorter this time too. Everything did. She didn't rush what came next. That was the thing about Margaret that people never understood, the thing Gerald's family had mistaken for weakness all those years. She didn't move fast. She moved right. She spent 4 days in the sealed building, sorting through every box, every folder, every rolled document and brittle envelope. She organized them the way she had organized 22 years of financial records at the hardware chain, chronologically, categorically, cross-referenced. The geological surveys went into one stack. The correspondence into another. The confidential Apex Mineral Trust reports, the ones that had never been meant for Franklin's eyes, she placed in a separate folder and sealed it with a rubber band she found in the desk drawer. By the time she was finished, the desk was covered in neat, labeled piles, and the story they told was airtight. Franklin Calloway had discovered in 1955 that Apex Mineral Trust had conducted unauthorized geological surveys beneath his land. Those surveys revealed a deposit of natural gas and rare earth minerals stretching across 3 adjacent parcels, all of which fell under the Calloway family's original mineral rights. Apex had attempted to acquire those rights through a lease agreement that dramatically undervalued the land, using a fraudulent surface-only survey to justify the low offer. When Franklin refused to sign, Apex pressured county officials to reclassify portions of the land as state-held mineral territory, a reclassification that was never legally completed but was used to intimidate Franklin into silence. Instead of fighting, Franklin sealed everything. Every survey. Every letter. Every piece of evidence. And he walked away, trusting that the documents would outlast the men who wrote them. He was right. Margaret carried the most important files down to the house in a canvas bag she found hanging on a nail by the door. She spread them across the kitchen table, lit the stove, and sat there in the warmth reading each one again, slower this time, checking her understanding against the numbers and the dates and the names. She was not a geologist. She was not a lawyer. But she was a bookkeeper, and bookkeepers know when the numbers don't match. And these numbers didn't match. Not even close. The lease offer Apex had presented to Franklin in 1956 valued the mineral rights at $11,000 for a 20-year term. The company's own confidential survey, conducted a year earlier, estimated the deposit beneath the same land at somewhere between $40 and $60 million. That wasn't an error. That was theft dressed up in legal paper. On the 15th day, Margaret drove to Lexington. It took her nearly 4 hours, the Civic groaning on the interstate, the heater still only working on the left side. She had called ahead, something she had spent 2 days working up the nerve to do. The University of Kentucky's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences had a public inquiry line, and the woman who answered had listened to Margaret's careful, measured description of what she had found with a silence that grew more focused with every sentence. By the end of the call, the woman had transferred her to Dr. Orrin Caldwell, a professor of geological sciences who had spent 30 years studying mineral deposits in the Appalachian Basin. Dr. Caldwell met her in his office, a cluttered room on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old books and coffee. He was in his late 60s, tall, thin, with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that moved quickly over the documents Margaret laid on his desk. She didn't explain much. She let the papers speak. He read in silence for nearly an hour. She sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, watching his expression shift from polite curiosity to focused attention to something she could only describe as controlled disbelief. When he finally looked up, his voice was different than it had been when he greeted her. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "From a sealed building on the property," she said. "They'd been there since 1958. He leaned back in his chair. These surveys, he said slowly, tapping the confidential Apex report with one finger. If these are authentic, and they look authentic, this is one of the most significant undocumented mineral deposits in the eastern Kentucky Basin. Margaret didn't respond. She waited. Dr. Caldwell removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The rare earth mineral concentrations alone, he said, the ones described in this 1955 survey, if they're accurate, we're talking about a deposit that would be worth, by today's market valuations, somewhere in the range of $200 to $300 million. The room was very quiet. Margaret heard the hum of the fluorescent light above. The distant sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall. $200 to $300 million. She let the number sit there. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She sat very still and let it settle the way snow settles on a roof, one flake at a time, until the weight of it changes everything beneath. Dr. Caldwell leaned forward. You need independent verification, he said. I can recommend a firm. Accredited, experienced with Appalachian mineral rights. They'll send a team to take new core samples and compare them against these historical surveys. If the results match, you will have a geological confirmation that is legally defensible in any court in this country. She nodded. How long? She asked. He thought for a moment. 3 to 4 weeks for the fieldwork. Another 2 for the lab analysis. 6 weeks total. She thanked him, gathered her documents, and drove back to the hollow. The drive felt longer this time. Not because of the distance. Because of the weight she was carrying. Not burden. Not fear. Just the weight of knowing something enormous that no one else knew yet. The verification team arrived on a cold Monday morning, 3 weeks after her visit to Dr. Caldwell's office. 2 geologists, a surveyor, and a field technician, all from an independent firm based in Charleston, West Virginia, called Ridgepoint Assessment Group. They came in a white van loaded with equipment that Margaret didn't recognize but understood the purpose of instinctively. Core drills. Sample containers. Ground-penetrating radar. They were there to look beneath the surface and tell her what was real. She let them work. She didn't hover, didn't ask questions every hour, didn't stand over their shoulders. She kept the stove going in the house, made coffee in the tin pot, and brought it up the hill to the team in a thermos twice a day. They worked for 12 days. Drilling in 3 locations across the property, taking samples from depths that Margaret hadn't imagined were reachable. The lead geologist, a woman named Dr. Anise Rourke, was quiet and precise, the kind of person who measured her words the way Margaret measured her numbers. On the 12th evening, Dr. Rourke came down to the house. She stood on the porch, hands in her jacket pockets, and looked at Margaret with an expression that was carefully neutral but couldn't quite hide the current running beneath it. The surveys are consistent, she said. Margaret waited. The deposit is there, Dr. Rourke continued. Natural gas reserves and a rare earth mineral vein that extends across the full breadth of your property and into at least 2 adjacent parcels for which you hold the original mineral rights. She paused. Our preliminary valuation, based on current market prices and estimated extractable volume, places the total asset value in excess of $270 million. Margaret leaned against the porch railing. She didn't say anything for a long time. The wind moved through the trees. The stove crackled inside. Dr. Rourke waited. What happens now? Margaret asked. Dr. Rourke pulled a folder from her bag. Our full report will be ready in 2 weeks. Certified, peer-reviewed, legally admissible. I would strongly recommend retaining a mineral rights attorney before any of this becomes public. She hesitated, then added, more softly, Mrs. Calloway, what you have here is not just valuable. It's historically significant. The Apex surveys from 1955 document corporate fraud on a scale that would have been a national scandal if it had ever come to light. Margaret took the folder. Thank you, she said. Dr. Rourke nodded, turned, and walked back up the hill toward the van. Margaret watched her go. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the folder. The numbers were all there. Verified. Confirmed. Real. She thought about Franklin Calloway, sitting at this same table 60 years ago, holding the same truth in his hands and knowing that the world wasn't ready to hear it. She thought about what it had cost him. His peace. His family. His life on this land. And she thought about what it had cost her. 47 years. A house she helped pay for. A name she had carried with dignity and received nothing for in return. She closed the folder and placed it on top of Franklin's original documents. 2 stacks. 60 years apart. Telling the same story from different ends. The truth was patient. It had waited. And now it was hers to tell. The attorney's name was Grace Yun. Margaret found her through Dr. Caldwell's recommendation, a mineral rights specialist based in Louisville who had spent 20 years handling cases involving Appalachian land disputes, corporate overreach, and legacy mineral claims. Grace was 41 years old, sharp-featured, unhurried in the way that people are when they know exactly how much power the right piece of paper holds. She drove to the Hollow on a Friday afternoon, reviewed the documents in the sealed building for 3 hours, and then sat with Margaret at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a legal pad covered in notes. "You have an extraordinarily strong claim," Grace said. "The mineral rights were never transferred, never legally disputed, and never extinguished. The county records confirm your deed. The original Apex surveys, combined with the independent verification, established both the value of the deposit and the fraudulent basis on which Apex attempted to acquire it." She paused. "But you should know that the moment this becomes public, you will face pressure. Legal challenges, corporate interest, media attention. It will be significant." Margaret looked at her. "I've faced pressure before," she said. Grace studied her for a moment. Then she nodded. "I believe you have," she said. They filed the formal mineral rights claim with the state of Kentucky the following Tuesday. Grace also filed a companion motion requesting a judicial review of the 1956 Apex Mineral Trust lease offer, citing the confidential surveys as evidence of corporate fraud. The filing was public record. It took exactly 4 days for the phone to ring. Dale called first. His voice was different now. Not measured. Not polished. Tight, strained, running on something between fury and panic. "Margaret, what have you done? What have you filed with the state?" She was sitting on the porch when he called, wrapped in her wool coat, watching the last light drain from the sky above the ridge. "I filed a mineral rights claim," she said. "On my property." "Your property," Dale repeated, and there was a sound in his voice she had never heard before. Something cracking. "That land belongs to the family. You had no right to go down there and start digging through things that don't concern you." "Everything in that building concerns me," she said. "It's on my deed. My property. My mineral rights." Silence. Long, heavy, the kind that fills with everything a person wants to say but can't. Then Dale spoke again, quieter. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Margaret said. "I've read every document Franklin left behind. Every survey. Every letter. I know what Apex tried to do in 1955. I know why Franklin sealed that building. And I know why no one in this family ever went back to open it." She let that sit. "Because you didn't want to know," she continued. "You didn't want to deal with it. You wanted it to stay buried because it was easier. Because the Calloways had moved on, built their lives on the assumption that the land was worthless, and no one wanted to admit that the man who sealed that building was right about everything." Dale's breathing was audible through the phone. "You listen to me," he started. "No," Margaret said. And her voice was steady, the same steady it had always been, only now it carried something new behind it. Something that sounded like a foundation being poured. "You listen to me. I was your brother's wife for 47 years. I kept his home. I managed his books. I sat beside him when the tremor started and held his hand when he couldn't remember my name. And when it was over, your sister stood in the hallway and watched me pack 2 suitcases like I was a tenant being evicted. You took the house. You took the savings. You took everything except a piece of paper your own lawyer accidentally put in the wrong pile. She paused. So don't call me and tell me I don't have the right. I have every right. And I have the proof to back it up. She hung up. The sky above the hollow was dark now. Stars had begun to appear, faint and cold and impossibly far away. Margaret sat on the porch for a long time, listening to the wind and the silence and the sound of her own heart beating steady in her chest. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel angry. She felt clear. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt perfectly, entirely clear. Patricia came next. Not by phone. In person. She arrived at the Hollow 3 days later in a rented sedan that looked absurdly out of place on the gravel road. She wore a camel-colored coat and low heels that sank into the mud the moment she stepped out of the car. Her face was tight, composed, but her eyes moved too quickly, scanning the property, the house, the building on the hill, like she was trying to calculate the value of everything she saw. Margaret was on the porch replacing a section of railing when Patricia walked up. She didn't stop working. This is ridiculous, Patricia said by way of greeting. You're living in a shack in the middle of nowhere and you think you've found some kind of treasure. Do you know how insane this looks? Margaret set the plane down and straightened up. She looked at Patricia the way she might look at a column of numbers that didn't add up but wasn't worth arguing over. You drove 4 hours to tell me that, she said. Patricia's jaw tightened. I drove 4 hours to talk sense into you before this goes any further. Dale says you've filed with the state. That you're claiming mineral rights worth, what, hundreds of millions of dollars. She let out a short, brittle laugh. Margaret. You're a bookkeeper. Margaret nodded. I am, she said. And I'm very good at it. That's how I know the numbers are real. Patricia stared at her. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not doubt. Worse. Recognition. The slow, sickening recognition that the person you had dismissed your entire life might have been paying attention to things you never bothered to look at. How much? Patricia said quietly. Margaret shook her head. That's not your concern. It is my concern. This is Calloway land. Margaret stepped closer. One step. Just one. But it was enough. This is my land, she said. My deed. My name. My mineral rights. And the documents that prove it were sealed in that building for 60 years while your family pretended they didn't exist. You want to know why Franklin locked that place up? Because he knew. He knew what was beneath this ground, he knew what Apex tried to steal, and he knew that nobody in his own family would have the patience or the courage to do anything about it. So he waited. He sealed the door and he waited for someone who would. Patricia's face went white. Not with anger. With something older. Something that looked like the first crack in a wall that had been standing too long. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Gerald, she started. Gerald signed the papers you put in front of him, Margaret said. When he couldn't hold a pen straight. When he didn't know what year it was. You made sure of that. Patricia took a step back. Her heel caught in the mud and she stumbled slightly, catching herself on the car door. Margaret didn't move to help her. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. There was nothing she owed this woman. Nothing she owed any of them. Not anymore. Patricia got back in the car without another word. The sedan reversed awkwardly down the gravel road, tires spinning once in the mud before catching. Margaret watched until it was gone. Then she picked up the block plane and went back to work on the railing. The wood was coming along nicely. Smooth. Level. Steady. The weeks that followed moved with a different kind of momentum. Grace Young's filings triggered a chain of responses that rippled outward in ways Margaret could feel even from the quiet of the hollow. The state's Geological Commission opened a formal review of the Apex Mineral Trust's historical operations in Harlan County. 2 members of the state legislature requested briefings. A reporter from the Lexington Herald-Leader called Margaret's phone and asked if she would be willing to talk on the record about what she had found. She said she would think about it. She didn't think about it long. The story ran on a Sunday. Front page of the regional section, below the fold but impossible to miss. The headline read, "Former bookkeeper uncovers decades-old mineral fraud in eastern Kentucky." It wasn't sensational. It didn't need to be. The facts were enough. Franklin Calloway's sealed building. The confidential Apex surveys. The fraudulent lease offer. The rare earth mineral deposit valued at over $250 million. And at the center of it all, a 53-year-old woman who had been handed a property transfer by accident and had the patience to read what was inside. The phone calls started the next morning. Not from Dale. Not from Patricia. From people Margaret had never met. Mineral rights firms. Energy companies. Environmental groups. Attorneys. Journalists. Researchers. The Hollow, which had been silent for 60 years, was suddenly the loudest piece of land in eastern Kentucky. Margaret didn't answer most of the calls. She let Grace handle the legal inquiries and the corporate overtures. She spoke to the reporter once more, briefly, and said only what she felt needed to be said. Franklin Calloway sealed that building because he couldn't fight alone. I'm not alone. I have the documents. I have the verification. And I have the law on my side. 3 weeks after the story ran, the state attorney general's office announced a formal investigation into Apex Mineral Trust's historical land acquisitions across 4 counties in the Appalachian Basin. The investigation would later uncover a pattern of fraudulent surveys, coerced lease agreements, and unlawful mineral rights transfers affecting dozens of families over a period of 3 decades. Franklin Calloway, it turned out, was not the only one who had been robbed. He was simply the only one who had kept the proof. Margaret did not sell the mineral rights. Grace presented her with 17 separate offers over the course of 2 months, each one larger than the last. The highest came from a consortium based in Houston, Texas, offering $212 million for a full acquisition of the subsurface rights and a long-term extraction lease. Margaret read the offer at the kitchen table, the same table where Franklin had sat 60 years ago, and she set it down the way she might set down a piece of junk mail. Not with contempt. Just with certainty. She told Grace she wanted to establish a trust. The Calloway Hollow Mineral Trust, managed independently, with revenues directed toward 3 purposes. First, environmental rehabilitation and sustainable extraction practices on the property, ensuring that whatever was taken from beneath the ground was taken carefully, responsibly, and with the land's long-term health protected. Second, a fund for displaced families in eastern Kentucky, specifically women over 50 who had lost homes, assets, or financial stability through divorce, family dispossession, or institutional failure. Third, a historical preservation endowment for Franklin Calloway's sealed building, which would be maintained as a permanent archive documenting corporate mineral fraud in the Appalachian Basin, open to researchers, journalists, and the public. Grace looked at her when she finished. "You're sure?" she said. Margaret nodded. "I'm sure." Grace smiled. Not wide. Just enough. It was the first time Margaret had seen her smile. "I'll draft the trust documents this week," she said. They signed them on a Tuesday, in the same county courthouse where Margaret had first confirmed her mineral rights. The clerk with the wire-rimmed glasses stamped each page with the county seal, and when he was done, he looked up at her and said, quietly, "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway." She thanked him. Then she drove back to the Hollow. Dale called one more time. It was late, past 10. Margaret was sitting by the stove, reading one of Franklin's letters for what must have been the 20th time. She answered because something in her, some quiet, tired part that still remembered the shape of the family she had once belonged to, told her to. His voice was different. Not tight. Not angry. Hollow. Like something had been emptied out of him. I saw the article, he said. She waited. We didn't know, he continued, and his voice cracked on the second word. We didn't know what was up there. We never looked. Margaret closed her eyes. I know, she said. A long silence. I shouldn't have, he started, then stopped. Another silence. The way we treated you, he said. After Gerald. The way Patricia. His voice trailed off again. Margaret listened to him breathe. She could hear the weight of it, the thing he was trying to say and couldn't quite lift. You spent 47 years, he said, and then his voice broke entirely, and he was quiet for a very long time. Margaret held the phone against her ear and let him be quiet. She didn't fill the space. She didn't comfort him. She didn't forgive him, not in words, not yet. But she didn't hang up either. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Margaret. She looked at the fire. At the walls Franklin had built. At the table where she had organized 60 years of truth, page by page, number by number. Thank you, she said. She meant it. Not because the apology erased anything. It didn't. But because it told her something she had needed to know. That what she had done had been seen. That the world, or at least one corner of it, had finally looked at her and understood what it had dismissed. She hung up gently. Set the phone on the table. And sat in the warmth for a while longer, letting the fire do what fires do, turn what's cold into something that can be lived in. Spring came to the hollow the way it always had, slowly, reluctantly, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The trees along the ridge put out their first leaves, pale green, almost translucent in the morning light. The creek that ran behind the property, frozen solid when Margaret had arrived, began to move again, tentative at first, then steady. She stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, and listened to it. The sound of water finding its way downhill. She had repaired the house almost entirely by now. New steps, new railing, new window glass in the kitchen and the front room. The stove had been inspected and reinforced by a local man named Curtis who had driven up one day unannounced, said Bess sent him, and spent 4 hours making sure the chimney pipe was properly seated and sealed. He didn't charge her. She tried to pay him twice. He refused both times. Said fixing things was just what people did when someone was willing to stay. The sealed building on the hill was open now. Its doors stood wide most days, letting air and light into the space for the first time in 6 decades. Dr. Caldwell had visited twice, once with a team of graduate students who spent 3 days cataloging Franklin's archive. He told Margaret it was one of the most complete private geological records he had ever seen. She asked him if Franklin would have been proud. Dr. Caldwell looked at the desk, the typewriter, the chunk of raw stone still sitting where it had been placed 60 years ago. I think, he said carefully, that Franklin Calloway would have been very pleased to know that the person who opened this door was someone who understood what it meant to keep careful records. Margaret almost smiled at that. Almost. She drove into town less often now. Not because she was hiding. Because there was less she needed. Bess still brought firewood once a week, though Margaret had long since arranged delivery from a local supplier. It was an excuse to talk, and neither of them pretended otherwise. They would sit on the porch, 2 women with nothing in common except a shared understanding that stubbornness was not a flaw but a survival skill, and they would talk about the weather, the creek, the way the light hit the ridge at certain times of day. Once, after a long silence, Bess said, "You know, my daddy always said that Hollow was waiting for someone." Margaret looked at her. "He was right," she said. Bess nodded. "I reckon he was." The trust was operational by early summer. Gratian oversaw the legal structure, and Margaret reviewed every document, every expenditure, every disbursement, the way she had reviewed hardware chain invoices for 22 years. The first grants went out in July, $12,000 each to 14 women in eastern Kentucky who had been displaced by divorce, foreclosure, or family dispossession. Margaret signed each check personally. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to see each name, each address, each life that was about to change direction because someone had opened a door and refused to close it again. One evening, late in the summer, Margaret walked up the hill to the building one more time. The sun was low, the air warm, the kind of warmth that settles into wood and stone and holds there after the light is gone. She stepped inside. The room looked different now. The shelves were neatly organized, each box labeled and catalogued. The desk had been cleaned, the typewriter covered, the map on the drafting table preserved under glass. But the chunk of raw stone still sat where Franklin had placed it. She hadn't moved it. She never would. Margaret stood in the center of the room and looked around. At the walls. At the shelves. At the door she had opened with a key she found in a kitchen closet, behind a row of mason jars no one had touched in 60 years. She thought about Franklin. About what he must have felt, sitting at that desk, knowing what he knew, and choosing to seal it away rather than watch it be stolen. She thought about Gerald. About the man he had been before the tremors, before Patricia and Dale, before the papers that ended everything in 11 minutes. She thought about herself. About the woman who had stood in a motel room with 2 suitcases and $1,100 and steady hands and nothing else. And about the woman who stood here now, in a building that held $270 million worth of truth that had been locked in the dark for 60 years and needed nothing more than someone willing to sit down and read it. She placed her hand on the doorframe. The wood was warm from the sun. Solid. Steady. The way she had always been. The way she would continue to be. She didn't close the doors when she left. She never did anymore. There was nothing left to seal. Nothing left to hide. Nothing left to protect by keeping it in the dark. The hollow was open now. The building was open. The truth was open. And Margaret Calloway, 53 years old, bookkeeper, survivor, the woman everyone had overlooked, stood on the hill above the house she had rebuilt with her own hands and watched the sun go down behind the ridge. The sky turned gold, then amber, then a deep, bruised purple that bled into black at the edges. Stars appeared. The creek whispered below. The stove in the house sent a thin line of smoke into the still air, rising slowly, steadily, a quiet signal that someone was home. She went inside. She shut the door gently behind her. And she sat down at the kitchen table, where 60 years of patience and one woman's refusal to be erased had finally, quietly, unmistakably, changed everything. A year passed. Then another. The hollow changed, not in the way places change when money arrives and strangers pour in with plans and blueprints and promises. It changed the way a body heals after something has been set right inside it. Slowly. Quietly. From the inside out. Margaret kept the house. She could have built something new, something modern with central heating and double-paned glass and floors that didn't creak when you crossed them at night. Grace had mentioned it once, casually, the way attorneys mention things when they want you to know the option exists without pressuring you to take it. Margaret shook her head before Grace finished the sentence. The house was the house. Franklin had built it. She had rebuilt it. That meant something she wasn't willing to trade for comfort. She did add a room. A small one, off the back of the kitchen, with a window that faced the creek. She did the framing herself, with Curtis helping on the days when the beams were too heavy for one person to lift. It took 3 weeks. When it was finished, she put a desk inside, a proper one, oak, heavy, with drawers that locked. She moved Franklin's notebook there, the one with the maps and the geological notes and the final letter that had changed everything. She placed it in the top drawer, next to a framed photograph of Gerald from before the tremors, back when his hands were steady and his eyes still knew her name. She didn't display the photograph for sentiment. She displayed it for truth. that man had existed. That marriage had been real. And no amount of legal paper or family cruelty could erase 47 years of something that had mattered, even if it ended the way it did. The trust grew. By the second year, the Calloway Hollow Mineral Trust had disbursed over $1.4 million to displaced women across eastern Kentucky. Margaret reviewed every application personally. She read each one at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the same careful attention she had once given to hardware chain invoices. Some of the stories made her stop reading for a moment. Not because they were too painful, but because they were too familiar. Women in their 50s and 60s who had lost homes, savings, dignity, all through mechanisms that were legal on paper and devastating in practice. Divorces that stripped them of assets they had helped build. Children who seized power of attorney and redirected bank accounts. In-laws who pressured and isolated until there was nothing left. Margaret knew every version of that story because she had lived one of them. And she understood something that the legal system rarely acknowledged, that the deepest damage was not financial. It was the erasure. The slow, systematic process by which a person is made to feel that their contribution was invisible, their presence optional, their absence unremarkable. The trust couldn't undo that. But it could do something almost as important. It could say, out loud, with money and structure and legal weight behind it, that these women existed. That their losses were real. That someone had noticed. Bess died in the spring of the third year. Quietly, in her sleep, in the house behind the general store where she had lived for 40 years. Margaret found out from Curtis, who drove up to the Hollow on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and his eyes red. She sat on the porch for a long time after he left. She didn't cry, not right away. She thought about the firewood. About the first day Bess had arrived unannounced with a truckload of split oak and hadn't asked for a thing in return. About the way Bess had looked at the building on the hill and said, "My daddy always said that Hollow was waiting for someone." Margaret drove down to the store that afternoon. It was closed, a handwritten sign taped to the door. She stood outside for a moment, then walked around back to where Bess kept her garden, dormant now, the soil dark and turned and ready for planting that would never come. She knelt there in the dirt and let herself feel it, the specific grief of losing someone who had shown up for you without being asked, without being obligated, without wanting anything except to be present. She added a line to the trust's charter that evening. The Bess Keller Community Fund. A subset of the larger trust, dedicated specifically to providing emergency housing assistance for women in Harlan County. The first grant went out the following month. $4,000 to a 61-year-old woman named Darla who had been sleeping in her car for 3 weeks after her son changed the locks on the house she had signed over to him in good faith. Margaret called Darla personally to tell her. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. Some things don't require words. They require someone on the other end of the line who understands exactly what the silence means. On the anniversary of her arrival at the Hollow, Margaret walked up the hill one more time. The building stood open, as it always did now. The late afternoon light fell through the doors and stretched across the floor in long golden rectangles. She stepped inside. The shelves were full. The desk was clean. Franklin's stone still sat where he had placed it, unmoved, unpolished, exactly as it was. She put her hand on it. The surface was cool and rough beneath her fingers. She stood there for a while, not thinking about the money or the trust or the legal battles or the apologies or the headlines. Just standing in a room that a man had sealed shut because he believed someone would come. And someone had. Not a geologist. Not a lawyer. Not a politician. A bookkeeper. A woman with steady hands who knew how to read a ledger and the patience to sit with a truth that no one else had been willing to look at. She took her hand off the stone. Stepped back. Looked at the room one last time the way you look at something you have earned the right to see. Then she walked back down the hill, into the house, and closed the door behind her. The smoke from the chimney rose into the evening air. Thin. Steady. Unbroken. The hollow held its breath for no one anymore. It was open. It was alive. And it belonged, finally and completely, to the woman who had stayed. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.